Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Carolyn Whitzman, who is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, a housing policy expert, posted a really interesting article from Bloomberg this past week called "The Housing Crisis: Packed Hospitals and Drug Overdoses. What Happened to Canada?" And she commented on it. And then yesterday we had the federal government to release a housing plan. And I think she's got some comments on that. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation today with Professor Carolyn Whitzman. Carolyn.
Oh, call me Carolyn, Brian. And okay. I really look forward to it.
I appreciate it. So let's start with this Bloomberg article. You seemed to be really negative about Canada after the Bloomberg article. I guess you were agreeing with it. Tell me what it said and what you thought of the article, which was, let me just quote one thing that you thought was important. In 2013, Canada ranked 13 out of 170 countries in meeting the basic needs of citizens, according to data tracked by Social Progress Imperative. By 2023, it had fallen from 13th to 39th, in large part because of the lack of affordable housing. Canada's fraying social safety net, says Carolyn Whitzman.
Yes, so that data isn't mine. It's OECD data, and I want to start off by saying that I'm an optimist by nature, and I think that Canada has wealth. It has one of the most educated populaces in all of the developed countries, all of the world's countries. So I think that Canada can do so much more. What we have is one of the highest levels of personal debt in the world, and it is fueled by hyperinvestment in housing. And we have, and this is very much in contrast to our self-belief about Canada as a fair country, we have one of the lower rates of social spending, and that very much is connected with decline in non-market housing since the early 1990s. So that's getting on for 35 years now, Brian.
It's interesting because I think that most people think that our social spending is pretty high, and that's one of the reasons why it leads to our deficits. And this article said, looking back 50 years ago, Canada had a relatively robust social safety net, reads a 2023 report from Food Banks Canada on rising food insecurity. But spending cuts in the 1980s and 1990s, along with a move to put more responsibility for economic and social well-being on the shoulders of individuals, caused low-income Canadians to fall further behind, the report says. Today, we are left with a social safety net that is filled with holes and that allows millions of people in Canada to fall through it. Do you agree with that?
I do. So if you look, I'll give you one point of reference that isn't specifically about housing, but's had a huge impact on housing, Brian. That's social assistance payments for people with disabilities or people who are out of the workforce for all kinds of reasons. That has fallen in relation to inflation since the 1990s. Protections for renters, which were quite high in the 1970s, started to decline in the 80s and have continued to decline. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing extremely high rates of evictions right now. So those two examples come from provinces. One of the things I really love about Canada's housing plan, which was released on Friday, is that for the first time in a really long time for housing, there's conditional funding for provinces, and that's linked to some building and zoning changes, which I and many housing experts believe are essential for better located housing, less reliance on cars, etc., but also for renters' rights. Canada's intervened twice before with provinces around renters' rights in the 1940s and then again in the 1970s. I think the buck does stop at the federal government in terms of basic rights to housing, livelihood, health, education. And frankly, if I'm going to blame one level of government, it's going to be provinces and territories for having dropped the ball over 30 years at least.
So some people think that using money as a bribe or as a manipulation to get cities, and provinces to do what they want is not democracy. And Daniel Smith, the premier of Alberta, has actually come out and I think has proposed a law that would not allow the federal government to get involved in bilateral negotiations and agreements with cities, saying that is the purview of the province. So, if the local population in a city don't want to do things and vote against things, why is it democratic that the federal government come in and try to bribe them into doing stuff with their money?
Well, transfer payments have been a reality of Canada for almost all of its history as a country. So I don't know whether that's a new thing to it or whether the term bribe should necessarily be attached to it. Similarly, the idea of conditional funding for basic standards on healthcare and long-term care is something that is, that's how Medicare was created across Canada, the current system of healthcare. So there's nothing particularly new about it. Sure, it's democratic, turn down the money. What the federal government has said is that it's willing, and I'm raising cheers about this, it's willing to negotiate with municipalities. I think that in many cases, municipalities are bearing the brunt of growing homelessness, emergency room stays, all kinds of issues related to inadequate housing. Maybe they should be directly getting the infrastructure funding that's needed, particularly since in Canada, 60% of the infrastructure costs are borne by municipalities who only have 9% of tax revenues. So I think it's going to be necessary for senior government to invest in critical infrastructure, and I'd include low-cost housing as part of that infrastructure. The municipalities simply can't and haven't done it alone. If the province is unwilling to do what it's supposed to be doing, then absolutely the federal government should step in. When you ask people, what's causing the housing crisis in terms of government inaction, they just see government as government. As I say, the buck stops at the federal government for basic rights like housing and healthcare. And it's great to see the federal government recognizing that.
So some people think that rent control was a disaster. Why do we need to put in more regulations in regards to protecting renters?
Yeah, there was a disaster in the early 1970s. It wasn't rent control. It was the federal government getting rid of a lot of tax-based incentives for purpose-built rental construction, apartment construction, such as some of the measures that were announced yesterday, including accelerate. God, it's a complicated tax measure, but basically it's allowing apartment owners to accelerate the depreciation of their properties and taxes so long as they invest in new purpose-built rental. That measure in 1972 led to a super sharp decline in purpose-built rental, with the result that about half of the apartment buildings in Canada that are rental date from before 1980. At the same time, the federal government brought in a huge tax incentive for owners, the principal residence exemption of capital gains tax, which it brought in 1992. In 1972. In 1972, the average house was affordable to about 60% of households under 35. By 1980, the average house was affordable to only 9% of households whose head was over 35. So there were some disastrous decisions made in the 1970s, bringing in rent control, which happened in most provinces and territories after 1975, wasn't it?
Really, that's interesting. And so you think that the government's current protections for renters are okay and will not restrict housing construction?
No, the current protections for renters are flagrantly not okay. The 1 in 10 renter households were evicted between 2016 and 2021. That's an unacceptably, sorry, that's in BC. It was 1 in 16 across Canada, but 1 in 16, that's unacceptably high. There are other countries that are much richer than Canada. Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Denmark, where the majority of households are renter households who are able to save towards retirement, have secure rental. We need to move towards equity between tenants and or renters and homeowners. That's really one of the only ways we're going to get ourselves out of the housing crisis, because after what is it, 50 years now of really bad government policy that promoted housing as the primary retirement vehicle, the primary investment in a household, that's been a mess. What we need is a set of renter, a Bill of Rights, which is what the federal government's been talking about, that enshrines longer leases, more protections against evictions. That's actually what we need. No, the renter regime right now across Canada is absolutely horrific. We need to do something about it.
So that
Just to give you, I'm going to give you a personal anecdote, Brian.
please.
So I moved to Toronto from Montreal in 1986. And I discovered that my landlord, who turned out to be a very shonky and actually violent character, he assaulted us, had raised the rent 42% from the previous tenant to us with no renovation, as we found out when we successfully took them to the landlord and tenant board. Well, once Mike Harris got in 1995, we wouldn't have been able to complain about a 42% rent increase, which is what it was. We wouldn't have been able to get that funding back. In the interim, we'd already moved because, as I mentioned, when we went to our tenants association, our landlord found out and actually assaulted us. We had to call the police. So we moved out. We were fortunate. We were able to move into non-market housing. We were able to move into a co-op almost immediately. It was a horrible experience for a newcomer to Toronto, but at least in 1986, we could complain and successfully complain about a 42% increase. What's happening now is that people can't complain and they just get evicted into homelessness because we aren't building co-ops anymore.
Let me read from the report that came out. Successive governments at every level and of varying partisan stripes chose not to invest in building homes. They failed to understand the need to build homes for future generations of Canadians. Over time, it became more challenging to build homes in Canada. Restrictive planning policies prevented the construction of high-density housing near existing infrastructure and transit. Municipalities started charging extra fees to help meet budget demands. Provinces fell behind on supportive housing investments, and the federal government pulled back when it should have stepped up. These factors created higher costs, construction delays, and a lack of affordable housing options. We are still paying the price today. You agree with that?
100%.
It's a pretty explicit and frank criticism of government by the government itself in this report. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Professor Carolyn Whitzman in just 2 minutes, talking about housing, a Bloomberg article that was incredibly negative about Canada, and the federal government trying to make some positive change. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Sorry, I apologize that. Our guest tonight is Professor Carolyn Whitzman. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. She's a housing affordability and planning expert. She's been talking to us previously. And just this week, she's posted several times, but once about a Bloomberg article that was very negative, I said, about Canada. Carolyn's corrected me, saying not negative about Canada, but negative about government action in regards to some specific items that specifically have an impact on both housing, but also on economic prosperity and the economic situation that Canadians find themselves in. And then also that the federal government released a major new effort on housing. Carolyn, this new federal government announcement, back just a couple of months ago, Prime Minister Trudeau said that housing wasn't a prime responsibility of the federal government. Now he's making this massive, major new announcement with lots of new money. Is he too little, too late, or is this the right decision?
I hope it's not too little, too late. Absolutely. The prime minister, perhaps his comms people got yanked back on that statement. I think it was about 6 months ago, maybe in September, saying that it wasn't primarily the federal government's responsibility. It is in law under the National Housing Strategy and Strategy Act, and it is in people's minds. They look to the federal government for answers. They clearly have been, and all of the major parties have been talking about what they plan to do around what's undoubtedly an affordable housing crisis. So, is it too little too late? That's something I'm wondering about. What the federal government's done is taken two very different approaches over the last 8 years. It had a national housing strategy that said that it was about ending homelessness and was about dealing with core housing need, which are low income people who can't afford their homes, or they're in overcrowded conditions or in really bad repair, which is absolutely true, particularly for Indigenous people, particularly for people with disability, particularly for single mothers. The only problem was that that strategy, which was launched in 2017, 2 years after the Trudeau government was elected, the programs actually weren't working to meet those targets. And then another report came out 2 years ago saying, look, we really need more supply across the board, but particularly purpose-built rentals, new apartment buildings. What this Canada's housing plan, it's called, tries to do is marry those two perspectives. And there's a lot in it that's really exciting, and a lot that just wasn't being discussed in 2017. Issues like zoning, issues like the building code, which gets in the way of small, affordable apartments, issues like modular housing. And the irony is that nobody was talking about modular housing before the one program that was most successful to help homeless and low income people, and that's called the Rapid Housing Initiative. All of a sudden, these really quickly built, very energy efficient homes started getting built by modular companies. Modular companies started growing across Canada. They started exporting to the US, and the federal government went, whoa, this is actually partly an industrial strategy. And, those of us who've been studying housing policy for a long time went, aha, they finally understand that. They finally understand that by investing in deeply affordable housing, not only is it going to help address homelessness, hopefully prevent homelessness, but it's actually going to grow the economy. Woohoo! So to bring it back to the Bloomberg article, it's actually good sense to focus on people's basic needs. It creates new technologies, or at least supports technologies like modular housing. It creates new jobs, and it creates just innovation, the kind of innovation that Canada desperately needs. Our productivity is lagging. Every single international World Bank and OECD says that Canada's productivity is lagging. Our GST per capita has gone down. And all of that is because the federal government, and this is over, as the article said, over conservative and liberal governments, has failed to recognize that meeting people's needs not just makes good social sense, it makes good economic sense, it makes good environmental sense. So I'm very happy in general with this current plan. Is it too little too late? We'll have to see what happens in the next election. It's not looking good for the Liberals.
I do agree that prosperity and productivity and getting the GDP per person per capita up is critical. And there have been numerous different articles and reports written about how we have this lack of a prosperity agenda and lagging productivity. There's no question about it. But in this housing report, it's really kind of interesting. To me, when I read it, a lot of the blame is on municipal governments, and come back to this. I called it a bribe. You called it transfer payments with conditions on it.
Yeah.
But they talk about how there's a $4 billion housing accelerator fund that they're going to increase by 400 million. So it's only 10% increase,
Yeah.
but still, and it's so more municipalities can cut red tape, fast track home construction, and invest in affordable housing. This will fast track an additional 12,000 new homes in the next 3 years. 12,000 new homes isn't that much. We need something like 3 million or 3.8 million, so it's not a lot. But it's attach housing conditions on public transit funding, where they, just to read some of the things, they want to eliminate mandatory minimum parking requirements within 800 meters of high frequency transit lines, allowing high density housing within 800 meters of high frequency transit lines, allow high density housing with 800 meters of post-secondary institutions, which is a new thing that I haven't heard of before, complete housing needs assessments for communities, building the necessary infrastructure to support communities. A lot of these things, when I read them, $1 billion available to municipalities to support urgent infrastructure needs to enable more housing, $5 billion for agreements with province and territories for infrastructure. A lot of these changes are really critical of the planning and zoning processes that we've put in place over the course of the last, not just couple of years, but it's been generations. And saying this red tape and regulation and the time to get approvals and the development charges are the problem, and they're going to use $4.4 billion of transfer payments as a bribe, or you would call it
Incentive.
An incentive to get municipalities to smarten up.
Yeah. So again, we have to go back to the 1970s. What is that, 50 years ago? And the growth of regulations that stopped what had been going on for generations in Canada to help affordability. Lots of people buying houses and then subdividing them in order to make them more affordable. Lots of rooming houses, which provided livelihood for single women in the early 20th century when they might have had property, but it was hard to find jobs. Lots of apartment buildings, which have been built in Canada for well over 100 years. Small apartment buildings, and that's made a huge difference in places like Montreal, which until recently has been much more affordable than other cities in Canada. So yeah, I think the government is looking back on some things that it did not terribly well. I actually see this as absolutely sensible stuff. And my only criticism is, why didn't you do this in 2015, frankly? So in 2015, I was in Australia at the time, living in Australia, but I remember reading that the new Trudeau government was going to be investing in affordable housing and sustainable transport and energy transformation. And I was like, woohoo, that's great. Let's go back to Canada. And the problem was that if you're going to give billions of dollars, which is what it takes to create a new train line, you want the maximum of people to use it. You don't want at the same time to have sprawl, eating up agricultural land, requiring roads because there's no way that you can build a train line fast enough to keep up with growth. You're not going to have energy efficiency with sprawl as usual. I think that linking those infrastructure investments, and as I said earlier, municipalities are working with 9% of the tax base. There's just absolutely no way that they can single-handedly afford train lines. I think that linking infrastructure investments to increasing housing nearby makes 100% economic sense and 100% environmental sense. And my only sadness or regret is that this kind of approach wasn't done earlier, because it makes 100% sense. And it's worked in so many countries across Europe in particular, and Asia, increasingly in Africa and South America. And it's taken a while for Canada to catch up and start fixing some of the mistakes it made 50 years ago and 30 years ago.
The presentation by the federal government of this new housing plan goes on and on and on. It's not a grab bag. It's a huge number of different initiatives. What's going on here?
Yes, I was referring to Shark Week because it was just 100% housing programming all the time for the last 2 weeks leading up to the budget. What's going on here is fairly clear from a political sense, and I know you're a very political animal, Brian. It's that housing is the number one issue on the minds of Canadians, and it's also very complex. And so there's sort of been one announcement per day in order to digest that announcement, I suppose, before moving on to the next announcement. And I'm no shill for the Liberal government or anything like that. I think that day hasn't been enough, but at the same time, you're not going to have like Shark Month or something like that. So there's a lot. There's clearly a lot that's going to be in the budget, and they didn't want to drop it all at once. They wanted to sort of, from a cynical perspective, take advantage of the news cycle for a couple of weeks before the budget. But also, housing's complex. There's no silver bullet.
There
So
is,
there's
but
every
it's something we've been talking about for quite a while, and not a lot seems to have happened. And there's been a lot of, two steps forward, one step back, if not two steps back.
yeah.
Last year around this time, the Housing Affordability Task Force in the province of Ontario released its report. There were something like 57 recommendations, only like half a dozen were implemented, and we had the debacle of the Greenbelt,
Oh, let's talk about Ontario. That was 2 years ago now. That was April 2 years ago. So it's exactly 2 years since the Housing Affordability Task Force came down with its recommendations, the majority of which were then ignored by the Ford government. And as I understand it, there's been sort of lots of screaming matches in cabinet. Fine, not acting on the recommendations of an expert task force because you're scared or because there's screaming matches or because it seems too scary or whatever is political cowardice. At least the federal government is starting to listen to the advice of people who've been studying housing their whole lives, and I'm certainly one of them. And you see also in British Columbia just such a contrast with what's going on in Ontario. A whole bunch of measures that were recommended by an expert task force in 2021 are being implemented again, sort of one per day. It's a bit dizzying sometimes, but the proof is in the pudding. Even though BC has a huge, huge affordability crisis, as does Ontario. The construction is up there much more so than in Ontario, and Toronto seems set to overtake Vancouver as the most unaffordable city in Canada, which is a title you don't want. So it's working in BC. It's taking time. The federal government is definitely assiduously taking notes on what's going on in BC, which is extremely popular, by the way. That's the most popular provincial government in Canada right now. And the Ontario government has its head in the sand.
This is interesting. The housing crisis has been something that people have been talking about for a while. Housing affordability has been an issue, and I think a lot of people, initially when the pandemic hit, thought that it would potentially create a bust in housing prices, and it didn't. It picked up, and if anything, it got worse. We had, as you mentioned, 2 years ago. I thought it was a year ago. 2 years ago. It's interesting that I thought it was only a year ago when it was actually 2 years ago. This housing affordability task force that recommended 57 different things, and only a few were implemented, and we had some fairly major fiascos. And then just last September, as you point out, Prime Minister Trudeau said that housing wasn't a prime responsibility of the federal government. And now it looks like it's the number one agenda of the federal government. And so it's turned on its head. What do you think of all that? Is that proof that Trudeau's actually listening and making positive changes, or is it proof that he was not listening in the past? And I guess I'm going to paraphrase terribly here, but I remember there was a quote that Pierre Elliott Trudeau made at one point in time when someone challenged him on a change of policy, and he said, when I hear new facts, I listen and potentially change my mind. What do you do when you hear new facts? Stick to your ideological bent and never change. So is the fact that the federal government is listening positive, or is it a proof positive that what they were doing in the past was wrong, or both?
Well, my dream is evidence-led strategy. So let's evaluate what's worked, let's evaluate what hasn't worked nationally, internationally, and then let's set policies that can last beyond government terms, because infrastructure takes a long time to build. Housing takes a long time to build. Even if we took care of all of the municipal approvals issues and everything like that, you're still talking about a 2 year at the very least lag between policy and getting stuff built. Um, if you're going to build a new train system or a new road system or a new set of bridges, you're talking about 30-year timelines. There's no government that has and should last for 30 years. And if you're talking about housing, you're talking about all three levels of government working together. And all three levels of government are never in Canada from the same parties. So it has to be a broad-based consensus, I hope, over the facts. I think that there's leadership that's being shown by Justin Trudeau, and certainly Sean Fraser, who's been the new housing minister now since around about September. I think he's made a big difference. I think in BC, Dave Eby and Ravi Kahlon have made a big difference, and part of my work is working with various governments, and I do feel that they're listening. They're listening to the actual developers of non-market and apartment housing. And I feel, frankly, that the Ontario government isn't listening. I just got back from Fredericton last week, Brian, and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are doing really cool things. And specifically in Nova Scotia, there were recommendations on an affordability task force that happened just before the fall of the Liberal government and the election of a Conservative government in Nova Scotia. And they're implementing the recommendations of the task force, which was brought in by a different government. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's what government should be. I'm just so, it shouldn't be like, oh my God, look at that dog walking on two hind legs. It shouldn't be that rare to have a government come in and go, yeah, those recommendations made sense. Let's move on them. But it seems to be in Canada that we can only make a plan as long as one level of government's in power. That's a recipe for disaster.
No question. We're going to take a break for some messages to come back in just 2 minutes with Carolyn Whitzman talking about Canada's housing crisis. A Bloomberg article that came out that was incredibly critical of what was going on in Canada, and a federal government that just announced a major new effort in housing. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. If you've been listening to my show for a while, you know that housing and housing affordability, the housing crisis has been one of the topics that I've been really focused on, because I really think that we've had a failure in successive governments and different government tiers of government, municipal, provincial, federal, to recognize and take action on this problem. I was really impacted by the conclusion of this federal government announcement, and let me read it to you if I could. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of country do we want to be? We can build a Canada where young people can pursue a career based on the quality of their opportunity instead of the cost of rent. We can build a Canada where families can afford a home of their own to raise their kids. We can build a Canada where seniors can find a place to live next to their grandkids. We can build a Canada where the people who build our houses and work in our communities can actually afford to live in them too. We can build a Canada where we read about homelessness in our history books and not in our newspapers. Carolyn Whitzman, by the way, is our guest tonight. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, and she's a housing crisis planning expert. Carolyn, I think a lot of that speaks to sort of the ethics, the morals of housing affordability, and I think we've lost that in the last years. And I think part of it is because, and I heard this really interesting interview with a person who said that we had this attitude of exclusion, that we excluded people from becoming professors or doctors or lawyers and buying homes, because it built up our value and it built up our net worth, and so therefore it was good. But we didn't realize, or at least we didn't allow ourselves to realize, that we were harming the next generation dramatically in that regard because we weren't giving them the opportunities that they deserve, and that the lack of the ability to house themselves affordably, and spending way too much money of their income, a higher percentage of their income on housing, was benefiting us because we had already bought it and we were enjoying the buildup in our net worth, but was harming the next generation, and we were giving the next generation a worse future than we had been provided by the generation that preceded us, and that this was a moral and ethical issue. And that's sort of what this conclusion from the federal government says, that people have to choose where they work based on what they can afford to pay in rent, not on where the best opportunity is. What do you think? Is this just platitudes, or is this really a change in attitude?
I sure hope it's a change in attitude, Brian. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to sort of think aloud about this plan, which just came out for me yesterday. And, it's great to have an hour to do some deep talking and thinking. As I mentioned, I just got back from Fredericton, where there was the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association conference, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with some Indigenous housing providers who I know. I was struck once again. First of all, I hang out with people who have a good sense of humor, and I have to say that we had a lot of fun together. But also, just the power and ingenuity of doing so much with so few resources, and quite often quite overt racism. And of course, the whole history of really bad policies. We talk about housing policies being bad. Let's talk residential schools. Um, I think that housing it's an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a moral issue. I find it very hard to grapple with the fact, I don't know about you, that in one of the richest countries in the world, in some of the richest cities in the world, we have people not only living in tents, but having their tents and belongings thrown out by the police as some kind of, response. And I'm like, it's going to be cheaper to give people homes. It's going to be cheaper to give people social services rather than ending up in emergency rooms or prisons. But even more than that, it's morally wrong to live in a rich society where some people have nothing and are threatened with death and disability because of it. So for me, housing is always a kind of moral issue. And yeah, I am really, really happy to see that kind of language being expressed. So it's partly the policies, but it's also partly how the policies are framed. And the policies need to be framed around basic human needs, basic human rights. What somebody living in Canada has an opportunity to do. So that's part of what I love about public policy. That's partly why I'm involved in research on public policy. No, I love what you just read out.
The one of the big recommendations here was these changes of density and height within 800 meters of a transit station. The provincial government supposedly has been thinking about something similar to this since August of last year and hasn't come out with it. And you mentioned BC. BC actually came out with some fairly significant changes within 400 meters of a major transit station. Do you think this is the solution, building density around transits? And if it is, and the federal government seems to think it is, and the NDP government in BC seems to think it is, how come we haven't implemented it yet in Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, population densities in cities have been going down since the Second World War. People have smaller families. People are building larger houses for smaller families. So I think that there is a critical mass of people that's necessary to justify train lines, to keep cafes going, to create the kind of lively buzz that I see outside my window as I'm talking to you. So outside my window as I'm talking to you, I see an industrial use across the street from me. I see a new 4-story apartment building just kitty corner to where I am. And I think that's wonderful. I'm fortunate. I'm relatively close to a train line in Ottawa, and I think that's exactly what should be built close to train lines so that more people can take trains and more people can take advantage of the grocery store that's just around the corner from me. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that's the way to go. And I think it's very frustrating that Doug Ford recently responded with such outrage, just outrage to the concept of a 4-story uh, building. It's like, how dare you make judgments about what people will, uh, can and should build, especially when you see all these monster homes jumping up. So, if you're a conservative and you believe in less government, how about getting out of the way of what people want and need in terms of housing?
Okay, so the counter to that is that it's democracy. That if the local communities don't want to have fourplexes near them or towers in their communities, near their GO train station, they should have the right to oppose it. And a lot of the changes here are taking away those rights for the local communities to oppose it. Is that democracy?
No, absolutely not. You don't have a democratic right to say, who's going to live next door to you. And this is people zoning. This is excluding low income people or people who rent. That's not democratic. Furthermore, people who voted for, again, I'm going to pick on the Ontario government, people who voted for Doug Ford. Doug Ford said he'd have a housing affordability task force. He said that he would listen to that housing affordability task force. He said no to development charges. Now he's saying yes to development charges. He's been waffling all over the place. So when you vote for a government, you want them to. You're not changing your vote or having a referendum every time policy changes. So, what is democracy? Democracy is voting for people who have good visions, good ideas to achieve those visions, and then actually act to achieve those visions.
This has been a very interesting and helpful conversation, Carolyn Whitzman. Thank you so much for joining us. Are you more optimistic about our housing crisis today than you were a week ago?
Well, I posted that Bloomberg article. It wasn't particularly an opinion. It was based on international statistics. The short answer is yes. Yes, I'm happy. There's a few things I'd like to see that aren't in Canada's housing plan, but yeah, I'm happy with Canada's housing plan.
It is kind of interesting that I reached out to you after you posted that Bloomberg article, which was incredibly negative about Canada,
Yeah.
and some of the policies. And you're right, it wasn't negative, but Canada was negative about some of the policies that different governments had implemented in regards to primarily housing, but also prosperity and productivity. But then by the end of the week, we had this very significant housing plan put forward by the federal government that is one of the most comprehensive plans I've ever seen, and really is a huge criticism of provincial governments and particularly municipal governments, and the role that municipal governments have played in restricting housing and restricting development and using $4.4 billion in incentives to try to get municipal governments to reduce regulation and red tape. I hope it has its desired impact. Thanks for joining us. This is Brian Crombie on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Thank you for joining. All of my shows are on my website, briancrombie.com. You can check in on them. And I really appreciate you joining us tonight. I have to say that I think that this housing crisis is the number one issue in Canada today. I do think that it is a moral issue as well as an economic issue. I think the economic issue is obvious because people are paying way too much for their housing. But the moral issue really is that we are and have created a situation where young people don't have the same prospects, the same dreams that older people have, because we've bid up the price of housing to this outrageous amount, and we didn't have to. And it is a creation of red tape, regulation, development fees, etc., by municipal governments, which I think the people in municipal government need to take responsibility for this. They made a mistake. I think, frankly, the federal government has shown with this policy that they recognize that they made a mistake. For the Prime Minister to last September say it's not a prime responsibility of the federal government to come up with this massive program, hopefully it gets implemented, is recognition that I was wrong when I spoke last September, and now I'm solving this problem. You know what I haven't seen in many, if not, frankly, any municipal politicians, is for them to say, we were wrong. We created this situation. We created this problem, and we were wrong. And we needed to show political courage, and we didn't show the political courage. And now is the time for us to do it. And we're going to build that additional housing, and we're going to put in that infrastructure, and we're going to make development charges reasonable. And we are going to do everything we can to build the housing that our next generation needs in our community. And if community groups come forward and they're NIMBYs and they argue, we're going to say what Carolyn just said. It's not democracy to say you can't have lower income or renters or people that live in apartments near you. We believe in free enterprise. We believe in capitalism. We believe in democracy. We believe that everyone should have a right to have a good house and to live their life. And I think it is not right when all of a sudden a whole bunch of homeowners get to say who else gets to live in their neighborhood. Do I think they have a right to be heard? Yes. And I'm a firm believer in democracy and referendum, but I don't think they have a right to stop and create a situation where effectively the next generation can't have the dream that they've enjoyed. So I think we've got to realize that this is not just an economic issue. This truly is a moral issue. We have done a massive disservice to the younger generation, to newcomers, to renters. And it's our municipal politicians and governments that have done that more than anyone else. Anyway, my 2 cents. Thanks for joining me. I remind you again, I'm on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM.